more importantly, the issues which media moguls set, and the issues which people in the community think are not necessarily therefore important. Why this is true? First, because it's an incentive for media to set these issues themselves. First, I think because often when these media moguls create lots of different outlets, there's incentive for them to help one outlet to break away, right? So if all your newspapers are covering one specific issue or larger topic, you then give one newspaper the notion to break out on one specific story, to choose a breakaway story. That means every other newspaper can generate dead weight, because every other newspaper is just there to sell the papers. Well, you choose one of your stories to make a breakaway story. But at the same time, every other newspaper is still focused on the exact same issue as you return.
Yeah, but the point is that the Times and the Sun, whilst being cross-subsidised, compete against each other because they're competing institutional cultures to set different right-wing agendas. No. Now you just have one newspaper setting that agenda.
No, we don't think that's true. Like, they express different viewpoints about the Times and the Sun, but they still discuss immigration, right? Just different viewpoints on immigration. They still discuss immigration. The issue is still the same thing. It's just the way those viewpoints are expressed on those issues. Whereas in our world, you get better because people determine the issues themselves rather than people deciding the issues. So that's the first essential thing for media to create hegemonies where one outlet can break away. So you choose breakaway stories from one outlet, and other outlets can then just continue to have dead weight newspapers whereby still expressing the same issues, not choosing breakaway story. Secondly, there's a massive incentive to determine issues which they can do things like win press awards or get you like certain benefits. Well, that means that when you choose certain issues, which are most likely to get these awards and get this type of coverage. We then think you have a massive attraction to journalists who want to read these massive newspapers, and then you get the best journalists going to the type of things which have things like press awards, because they chose the types of issues they think can best take these awards, or best take the types of things that help you. So in that sense, again we recognise there's a massive incentive to determine issues which can be really bad. Thirdly, we recognise there's a greater incentive to narrow people's spectrum across outlets rather than appeal to different opinions. And there's all this really thing pertains to my second point, which is the way that people conceive of truth in the terms of media, right? We often recognise that what Jack calls isn't necessarily true, because often normal individuals on the street don't know the fact that one media outlet owns lots of different newspapers, right? It's not necessarily common knowledge that one man owns lots of different newspapers and TV stations. What does that mean then? It means that when one issue is being focused on by all these different types of outlets, the individual gets the impression that this issue is an important one. Why? Because if lots of different outlets are focused on the exact same issue, it's perceived by the individual to be a fact claim which may be pertaining to truth, or to be a claim it's not true, but it's certainly important. So when the individual has lots of different outlets, and all expressing the same thing, you don't necessarily know that one individual is determining the issues those outlets discuss, we can therefore have no kind of choice of what kind of media they're actually being exposed to. It's those lots of different types of media realising they all pertain to the exact same issues. What does that mean then? It gives a relative importance of that issue to the individual's mind. Why? Because simple psychology, the individual often sees lots of different outlets discussing the same issue, either in the same way or in different ways, but still the same issue at the heart of the debate. And that means the individual sees that as being important to me as important to everyone else in my society. The individual becomes collectivised in the way they see these issues. If all these media industries are looking at the exact same issues, which must be of certain importance to me, what does that mean then? Well, it first means that when people, small media outlets like blogs, have to also discuss these issues, because they're issues that people believe pertain to them. These are the issues people believe are important. These are the issues that people are reading about. That means that small news organisations are not able to try and do breakaway stories or stories about different issues, because nobody will read them, because they perceive that the issues that are important to them are the issues set by lots of media channels that realise that the media channels are all owned by the same person who has the exact same agendas and the exact same issues. In that sense of things, individuals don't make a discerning choice of what issues might affect them in their life. It's going to make a choice based on what they perceive to be the issue set through the media. Because first, media is not often irrational, so it's not often something that we often just debate or discuss. We often just read newspapers or television in a state of relaxation, a state of enjoyment, rather than actual considered thought. Because that's often also these intelligent people expressing ideas like journalists and TV presenters. That again means that these intelligent people who are giving us these viewpoints must be setting the issues that matter to me as an individual. That means there's less than for a smaller media organisation trying to set different issues, and these are only issues they can talk about, these are only issues people care about. And secondly, means that people in themselves are less likely to pursue issues that matter to them, because the only issues they recognise and perceive matter to them are those ones that are projected as truth or particularly significant by the media moguls. We as supposed to recognise there's a broader spectrum of debate. It's just about views, it's about the issues these media organisations set. Because the way people perceive media, they perceive truth, and they accept these issues and refuse to determine them for themselves. Because we believe people should determine these issues, not media companies. We urge you to vote.
I thank the Speaker and now call upon the Member of Opposition to continue the round. gentlemen of the audience. Right, the slogan on your my t-shirt you might be able to see makes as much sense as the proposal given to you by Oxford and the extremely sensible decision to institute mocktail finals made by the World's Council yesterday. I also want to pay tribute to the dance speaker for being the first on-site competition to go through their entire speech without concealing the case. I would have been grateful had you spoke somewhat less incredibly quickly, as I'm still hungover. I'm going to talk about three things. Don't think that's going to stop me going through this now. I'm going to talk about the BBC in more detail, why on its own destroying the BBC is a harm not justified by any of the silly things government talked about. We're going to talk about political minorities, how they're shut out without vertical integration, horizontal integration. We're going to talk about the race at the bottom, and why accentuating the profit motive is really terrible, given what things are profitable in this industry. First, some quick points of rebuttal. Firstly, I'm going to reiterate my POI. At the point at which you start subsidising media organisations, everything else in this debate has essentially become irrelevant, because that solves all the problems dealt with by both sides. So we're going to presume that that hasn't happened in order that we can continue having a debate. Because you did then solve all of your problems with challenge and barriers to all of them, right, when you start giving unlimited state funding, and you also, as I pointed out, do still have one holding company, the state, which is funding everyone. Right? So you have just made yourselves irrelevant. Secondly, right, the reason why it's a squirrel is you never told us why there is a difference between news and entertainment channels such that you can tell them apart and you don't have to leave the word all in the motion, given that almost all channels do cover some news and factual broadcasting. Right? That's just true of everyone. Even CBeebies, the children's channel for BBC, carries news. Right? So, congratulations on making yourselves irrelevant for this debate. Right. Secondly, going into the extension speech that we just heard, you said it's okay that we're going to have less funding for investigative journalism, because those people are really enthusiastic and will accept low pay. We don't think that's going to help them when they need to rifle through Oliver Leckham's bins in order to put together his shredded newspapers, right, his shredded official documents. That requires like 50 people to piece things together. That requires funding. And we also are tremendously excited about the concept of happy amateur John Simpson without his Kevlar jacket, his bodyguards and his interpreters, because those people won't work for free and Kevlar is not cheap. You need resources to do investigative and foreign journalism. Right, that's why you need money. We'll come back to that later. Finally, she says the only reason why British newspapers are talking about immigration is because Rupert Murdoch owns them. I would point out that the Daily Mail is not owned by Rupert Murdoch, the Glasgow Herald is not owned by Rupert Murdoch, and the Independent and Guardian are both also not owned by Rupert Murdoch and on left-wing papers. I think the reason they're talking about immigration might be because immigration massively affected the British people in the last 10 years, drove down labour wages because of mass mobility, which we talked about in like 3 rounds. Labour mobility might be a real thing that might impact people. That might be the reason why newspapers were talking about it, and not a sinister corporate plot. Sometimes the easier answer is true. Okay. Oh, and finally, there's this terrible harm that people might not know that Rupert Murdoch owns news channels. I think most average high-road slum dwellers could tell you that Rupert Murdoch owns several news channels. But even if that was really a problem, you could just require they carry a logo in the corner of the channel, like the BBC does, like Fox channels do. Just put a big old corporate logo in there, then everyone can see it and they would know. Problem solved. Again, we don't need the problem. Right, first the BBC. We think it does some things that are pretty important. Right? We think the World Service is one of a single most important human achievements we have at the moment. Right? It's just incredibly high-quality journalism being put into poor countries for free. That is only able to exist because you have one vertically integrated, massive news organisation with multiple outlets. Right? It has important things like BBC World Service Push To, which is the only non-sectarian broadcaster in Afghanistan. If that had to compete with regular BBC World Service, that would be a massive problem. If it couldn't be cross-subsidised by BBC World Service and CBeebies and BBC One and BBC Two and all of the other vastly more profitable channels, it wouldn't exist. right? You also have things like the BBC Asian Network, which deals with the problems of South Asians in the United Kingdom and across the world. Right? That means that that organisation is funded, because on its own it's not possible. That's why Dawn TV failed in the UK and the previous launch before that, because you did need cross-subsidies. It also means when something happens in the Asian community, the BBC has a correspondent on hand, which it would not have otherwise, right, because it couldn't afford to, because that thing is expensive, right, and those minority issues get played. We'll come back to that later. These are things that only exist in large, vertically and horizontally integrated organisations, because they're incredibly expensive and deeply unprofitable. They are not going to exist on their own, except obviously with subsidies, right? But that, as I said before, consider the debate. Right. So secondly, actually, I'm taking now. Anyway.
Subsidies don't allow you to compete in an oligopolistic market for the reasons we gave, self-referencing and incentives for journalists and regulators. They might allow you to stay afloat in a more fragmented one. It's not a concession.
No. Except that they do, right? That's how they freed Evening Standard to go for an enormous amount of the London daily newspaper market as a new entry. Right, because it had a massive subsidy from the rest of the Evening Standard Group and could be offered for free. When you can offer media for free due to massive subsidies, surprisingly people like free things. That's just easy, right? Political minorities, particularly through everything I've just said of political minorities, like the right-wing newspapers in the 1980s in the United States, left-wing newspapers now. When you have a group of people, your competitors, who for ideological reasons will shut you out, you need integration in order to work. Right? So that's another area where you do need large groups. Also true of Kurdish media groups trying to work in Turkey, because Turkish language groups will frequently exclude them. Unless they can cooperate and cut costs by forming one group, they won't be allowed to survive. And finally, right, first I've already said some of this stuff. When you have to be super profitable, right, you do get more gossip, right? You get more sensationalism, you get more things like phone hacking done purely for profit. Right, you get less foreign bureaus, as already said, you get less niche interests. Like 538 is just good that the New York Times picked that up. Right, the more people can read that, because statistical analysis of politics is a good thing, and I'm delighted that more people have heard of it. Right? So you get less good things and more bad things when you adopt the model of government, though obviously they made their own model irrelevant. We beg to oppose.
Out the round for the government day.
Right, first of all, Mr. Speaker, simply come up here and say, well, Rebecca spoke a bit fast for us, does not count as engagement with our extension, first of all. What I'm going to do is I'm going to engage with their extension on what there was of it, and then I'm going to make 3 points. I'm first going to talk to you about how media corporations have a financial incentive not just to monopolise the market under the status quo, but to monopolise the news agenda and the issues within it. Second, I'm going to talk to you about how that fundamentally shapes the individual opinions in a really bad way. And third, I'm going to talk about how it leads to worse, less accountable journalism engaging with art all the way. Before we do that, I want to do a little bit of rebuttal. So first of all, we've got Octo come up here and say, well, the opening government team is squirrel because they never told us why news is different, right? I mean, first thing we have to see, possibly a little bit unfortunate. But Rebecca's extension was nonetheless consistent and very illuminating, Mr. Speaker. Why was that? Well, because what we told in the extension was how individual opinions are shaped by those things which individuals are surrounded by, right? That includes CBeebies, okay? We're having to concede that CBeebies is probably not going to be a particularly pernicious influence, right? Which is why we're restricting this to news corporations. Nonetheless, though, we're consistent, yay. Next, they told us, the BBC World Service is really awfully good, you know. And what's this we say? Like, on their point about how it can only exist if it gets funding from elsewhere. Firstly, empirically false. The BBC World Service is funded by BBC Worldwide. It's the corporate arm of the BBC. It isn't funded by taxpayers' money. Second, though, this is just one example, man. So you can't win a debate by standing up here and saying the BBC is good, so you should let really, really bad media companies continue nonetheless. Finally, they told us, well, when you have to be super profitable, right, you've got to be sensationalist as well. We think nonsense. They provided no analysis for why that was the case. And we actually managed that in loads of cases, the fact that organisations are super profitable can mean they can afford to be less sensationalist because of media habits, some of Rebecca raised extensions which we get no response to. So, first point about how media corporations have a financial incentive to not just monopolise the market, but monopolise the news agenda by setting issues. We talked about three main things here. Firstly, we talked about how, when you have a big corporation that owns lots of media outlets, there is a direct incentive, not just to get as many readers as possible, but in that cause, Madam Speaker, to create a media hegemony so that particular individuals can break away from that hegemony. Why is that the case? We told you that media is something which is often very connected to individuals' habits, right? People tend to read the same kind of newspaper, watch the same TV channel a lot of the time. What we think happens when a corporation owns lots of these, thank you, is it's able to do what newspapers need to do in order to drive more readers to them and earn more profits. Namely, have a big story, which means somebody who normally buys the Sunday Times instead goes out and buys the Telegraph. We think at the point where media corporations can control the narrative across their multiple outlets, they're much more able to ensure those breakaway stories and to use their own incentives and own interests to control that agenda. Secondly, we think in terms of controlling that agenda, they have an incentive to determine issues so that they can do things like win press awards, so that they can do things like get better journalists, so they can do things like increase their profits. We think that's especially true if you want to buy the stuff over not say about cross-funding. Thirdly, we say that there's a greater incentive to narrow the political spectrum across different outlets rather than to appeal to different opinions. And this clashes with the central tenet of opening upright. Because what they say is that basically when you have lots of these media corporations, what they're able to do is fund the left-wing newspaper that's not as popular as the right-wing newspaper, and that's good because we get a plurality of opinion in the discourse. We say that's absolutely not what happens under their system. Why? Because we think it's much better for these companies to narrow the political spectrum and to move the left closer to the right, so that the majority of their news coverage is likely to appeal to the biggest number of people. On to the second point about all of this, how all of this fundamentally shapes individual opinions. Because first we told you, thank you, about media habits, right? The fact that particular people have particularly reliable connections with certain media sources and outlets that we can depend on, and that these corporations can depend on in terms of deciding what to say and what not to say. Secondly, we told you about ignorance, about how people just often don't know about the fact that Rupert Murdoch is behind a lot of the issues that are being isolated and identified under the status quo, right? Now, to this, we've got a very, very bizarre response. Oscar came up here and said, no, thanks, Jack. He said, people can tell you that, people will probably tell you that Rupert Murdoch owns a lot of newspapers. The point is probably not which ones, first and foremost, but also, that's not the point. When he tells you about how you can put a logo in the corner, the debate here is about people having the choice to have as impartial and broad a representation of views as possible, right? If you've just got lots of corporations all spreading pernicious messages, but with a healthy logo there to tell you that's what they're doing, that's not a much better situation. Thirdly and finally, though, let's go to the heart of what Rebecca told you in extension. We think simply the existence of these kinds of narratives about these kinds of issues already gives them significance, right? At the point where the Daily Mail is reporting on immigration and on Polish immigrants to the United Kingdom, to an extent they have already won, in that now that becomes much more of an issue upon which other news outlets report. Then you get the left-wing newspapers having to counter those opinions and having to present different spins on those stories, but you've still got the issue having been determined by people for all the reasons that we've said, attached to profit motives and being more likely in these big corporations. Jack?
Yeah, but the point is you get different views on those issues under our side of the house because you have multiple different holdings that have different journalistic incentives. Right. On yours, you simply have a right-wing paper which not only determines the issues, but what people think about those issues.
Okay, I'm going to engage this to an extent when I talk about how it's actually in their interest to change the political spectrum to make it narrow. But let me just engage a little bit more by using your points about investigative journalism, which is basically what they're hanging their hats on this issue, right? We think, firstly, they just asserted that investigative journalism does not happen in popular news outlets. I think that's an absolute lie. We think actually that some of the most profitable news organisations are the ones most able to fund this sort of investigative journalism. What we also add on to that, Madam Speaker, is that often just presenting a popular spin on the issue still requires you to have isolated the issue, right? So we think that's fine. But also what we say is that actually the kind of investigative journalism is the kind of journalism we're most likely to see happening online, right? Which is something that they try to poo-poo on that side of the house by saying that the problem is you don't get capital being driven. We think actually investigative journalists are some of the people most driven to get these stories out there, even if it's at their own cost. But we also think, man, it's the kind of, we just don't accept that the arguments they gave us about high startup costs. Anybody can set up a news outlet online, a blog or something for free, get millions of viewers to it, we don't see that as a problem. Lastly, in terms of this stuff about competition and a culture of competition within companies, right? We think that firstly, like when Jack comes up and say, well, the Times still reports on the Sun's corruption, we say firstly that's a perfect example of a media organisation profiting even from its own screw-up, right, in a way which is really, really bad. Exactly what we mean about them setting the issues to their own self-interest. But secondly, we think we're much more likely to get cross-scrutiny on our side when there is no shared profit motive at all, or a much less one, right? This is a comparative in this debate, Madam Speaker, right? Well, obviously we accept on this side of the House that individuals are always going to be subject to influences around them which form their opinions. But we think any flourishing democracy must, as much as possible, allow individuals to set the issues at the heart of the news agenda and not a self-interested, profit-driven media elite. It's why I'm very happy to propose.
Thank you, Speaker. And now I invite up the opposition whip to close out the round.
Mr. Speaker, so this debate is mostly about how people think. And specifically it seems to have come down to how the media influences how people think, and how the proposition world or the opposition world makes people think better or gives them more of what they want or leads to that better world. They vote for better things and don't vote for silly things. So I'm going to look at this in a lot of ways. First, I'm going to look at plurality of views under the proposition and under the status quo and show why their model actually makes the world a worse place. Secondly, I want to look at the quality of journalism and the amount of information out there that's available in terms of the market information, show again why the world is worse under what they set up. So jumping right in under the plurality of views. Because we're told that under the problem in the world apparently is that there are big media corporations and big groups that own all the information, or just own enough of corporations that they can set the agenda, they can set the message and make lots of people believe it. Firstly, there are just a couple of problems in terms of we're not quite sure where this is the issue. Because the examples of the sort of things they give that have too much control are things like the BBC and things like Rupert Murdoch owning the Sun, which sort of happen to exist in the same country. We think at that point, it's not necessarily the case, no thank you, that there is total control by one group because these different groups are competing. No thank you, we think that's just secondly an issue. But also we do want to know that we can test on opposition that just because the same group or the same company owns you means you have to take the same line. We know that the Sun and the Times do tend to take different lines of analysis on things, and occasionally we disagree. No thank you, first opposition gave you some reasons to believe this. Firstly, the whole institutional culture aspect, where the people at the Sun want to be different to the people at the Times and vice versa. We think that's important. Secondly, the fact, no thank you, that their readers can talk to each other and compare views, no thank you, and talk to other people. Thirdly, laws on editorial control, which don't really allow Rupert Murdoch to sit in a secret room and write the headlines of everything he owns. No thank you, just not the real world. But next we were told the big problem is barriers to entry, and cost is the issue. Firstly, they solved this by saying we can subsidise really small ones. We think that's a much better proposition than what you brought us, and that makes your proposition irrelevant. But secondly, we note that even if you get rid, no thank you, of the very biggest ones, this doesn't make it cheaper to be in the market. I also told you lots of reasons why they're just objective costs and things that are expensive to hire, like Kevlar and translators, which are just as expensive, no thank you, if you're small, even if there isn't a big guy. So you don't really fix that. Thirdly, I also told you about the fact that, the ability to subsidise if the government were to do this would make anyone competitive, because at best it could make it free, and people will go for the free news versus the expensive one, no thank you, at least to an extent. Right? That could get it out there. No. Next they told the problem was false diversity. We think this is actually really interesting. We see you still don't get the diversity they want under the proposition, indeed it's worse. Firstly, because of the first proposition, I told you about why most newspapers just stop existing in a lot of countries, because there's only one profitable one. They never dealt with that apart from their subsidies point. Secondly, we think the advertising point here for thank you. Because if newspapers have to turn to advertising in order to make their revenues, this makes them more beholden to advertisers. Sure. No, thank you. But secondly, and this goes back to what actually Oscar says, advertising is a more pernicious way of having false diversity than the status quo. Because people, no thank you, are at least more likely to know that Rupert Murdoch owns several corporations than they are to realize that most advertisers have shared, no thank you, corporate interests and are similarly beholden to the corporate world. That is a far more pernicious way of disguising political influence, no thank you, than when you can know Rupert Murdoch owns it, rather than knowing that Procter & Gamble and maybe other corporations have similar interests overall. Thirdly, if you do bring in your subsidy system, the state now subsidizes everyone, and again, we think they mentioned Berlusconi, who controlled the state media. We think the state media don't actually like to use those subsidies to prevent a certain amount of diversity when it comes to control. But coming again to Oscar, because you said what's important here. No, is you need vertical integration. You need to access different markets, right? If you're the Kurdish media outlet, if you're a Kurdish group who wants to get you out of Turkey, like you mentioned, there may not be enough of a market for you just to be profitable selling newspapers. No, thank you. Or not enough of a market just to sell a TV channel. But if you can do both, you have access to more profits and a larger market, which means you can compete. No, thank you. Why is this important? This is important because this means political and ethnic minorities who other companies don't like, who other news outlets won't share with and work with, and I'll take opening in just a second, can actually get into the markets because they have access to this sort of advertising, and access to the wider markets that they can do. Yeah,
you can keep asserting that there'll be this diversity, but why would the editorial staff of either the Times or the Sun ever go against the central ideological and class interests of the people that own them, which was our case?
Okay, you don't have to argue that the Sun and the Times represent completely different groups. That's never been the opposition line. But it is the line that certain groups will drop out of the market entirely. No, thank you, like the one left-wing newspaper, no, thank you, which is small if it can't integrate with the left-wing TV station and share markets, or the Kurdish one, which can't integrate vertically. We think that's the problem. Like, you don't necessarily change that, but you drop the other ones out entirely. That's it.
Question, sir.
No, like, why is this true? It's because you do have to be big to survive, right? Investigative journalism is really expensive for everything Oscar told you. If you have less investigative journalism, you have less of the criticism of media companies by each other. No, thank you. You have less foreign respondents. And also, in terms of like raising the issues, also, this is like, I know there's another response to their extension. We think minority and ethnic and minority interest political groups are incredibly important when it comes to, thank you, raising issues than it is just raising viewpoints, right? If every Turkish majority newspaper ignores Kurdish language issues in your country, you've got to have one that can represent Kurds to get that issue out there, not just that viewpoint. Like, we say also the fact that the BBC can now afford to have dedicated reporters. It's expensive. No, thank you. Say, it's bad to refer to all those things. Okay, so next we just talk, the final idea is like, the problem is that like this sets the agendas for blogs. Well, I should go, Jack, yeah.
Okay, right. Why should the Murdoch papers, through their monopoly, be allowed to make something an issue that the Guardian has them to report on, instead of individual members of the Democratic electorate?
Well, we don't think it's a bad thing that newspapers have to talk about what each other says. The point is the Guardian exists on this side, and can similarly make Murdoch report on the Guardian's issues, because they're both out there, and you can't look like a fool and not report on what other media corporations are reporting. You lose that on this side when you lose the ability of minorities to more effectively insert their issues into the market. But secondly, on the quality of journalism. Because like, we think what Oscar told you here is important about the race to the bottom, right? If suddenly, as a corporation, against a newspaper, for example, it's much more important to make a profit because you can't be cross-subsidized by a TV station that makes a bunch of money. This means you have to go for what sells the most copies, right? This means you have got to go for the celebrity. This means you've got to do things like phone hacking and anything that will give you an edge. We think that profit motive is massively damaging to the quality of journalism, which goes out and informs people. Like, in terms of also just setting issues, we think it's very odd that the proposition has given us a model which seems to think entertainment channels don't set issues, right? The fact that, what happens in popular TV shows doesn't affect how people perceive the important issues in their nation to be. We think they're still missing out on that, and they haven't fixed that. And again, it's significant to the quality of journalism. So, Mr. Speaker, we've told you all the reasons this doesn't lead to what proposition wants and leads to a much worse world. And for all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.